Before we start, just for those of you that, going back to the technical things, obviously Portrait of Gaia with a digital file, also Hugh McDermott as well. For those of you that aren't familiar with the 16mm format, I'll just briefly give you an idea.
Show and tell.
So yeah, the films you saw that were on 16mm, like aerial or colour poems, so when you see all the poppies and things, it's literally that kind of width going through the projectors at the back there. Margaret Tait did have her own projector, so she would project on the wall at home or later on in her studio. So there's a kind of magic aura moving between the formats like that. In terms of the camera she used, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of Bolex camera she used. They're surprisingly heavy. They normally got the 3 lenses that you often see. If you see some of the photos of her at film school, you'll see early on the camera's always on a tripod. And a number of her films, particularly the early ones, are all filmed from a tripod. Later on, you'll actually notice that the camera, she lifts it off, and particularly in place of work, you'll actually see her panning around and you'll see her holding the camera itself. It is clockwork. The length of the reel she used was 100 foot, so that's about 3 minutes of film. Generally, you might be getting about 12 or so shots off it. You'd be using a separate light meter, so that was another thing to contend with. And of course, sound as well was separate. So she would start sort of weaving these together in the editing kind of process. The other aspect with the film, when you start holding it, as I think Jonas Meekers said, you know, when you're actually holding it handheld, it's very close to the brain. It's just above the heart. So there you are. Anyway, a little bit about 16mm. But maybe we should start with So. Would you be happy to?
Sure.
Great, thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be here talking about Margaret Tait's work, particularly because I very rarely get to be a poet in a film space, and I'm going to be talking about Tait as a poet and the relationship between her written poetry and her film poems, because she also self-published 2 beautiful chapbooks of poetry and some chapbooks of short stories. And she ends the final poem of her first poetry collection, Origins and Elements, which was self-published in 1959, with what I think is a brilliant summary of how she makes her art. And she writes, "But there's so much to say that by the time I fine it down, there's only one word left. And then that word has to go too, being inadequate, and only my eyes are left for saying it all. Erasing words until only eyes are left, it is a filmmaker's poem, to be sure, as Tait made a poet's films. Or rather, I think she questioned the line between forms, media, and practices. But given that she was already working in one marginal art form, why did Margaret Tait also write poetry? Well, for starters, it's a lot easier than using a Bolex, just physically. And perhaps one way to think of it is that she was always doing both. As Sarah Neely notes in her introduction to her wonderful collected edition of Tait's poems, stories, and writings, published in 2012 by Carcanet, Tait's archive contains rafts of unfinished drafts and fragments, which Neely says may be observational poems, but they may also be planned shot lists for short films. They may be both, they may be neither. They're unfinished, unbound, and undated. After all, this is the artist who ends the credits of her film The Leaden Echo and The Golden Echo by noting that she began collecting the material in 1948 and, quote, returned to it now and again and completed in 1955. Neely adds, quote, Tait's exhaustive listing is all part of the rough material with which she worked. But for Tait, the process is as important as what comes out of the process. Now, we live and work in a culture where process is not particularly valued. It's all about product. And it's also very hard to think about poetry and filmmaking as processes that are co-constitutive in that same system. It goes against the majority of the British filmmaking and indeed poetic tradition. Tait herself saw her closest precursor as being the poet and playwright Federico Garcia Lorca, who also wrote a sadly unmade surrealist first film script. And I think she also has close affinities among the Italian filmmakers whose work that she knew through her time in Italy, with Pier Paolo Pasolini, who published an award-winning collection of poetry, Mamma Roma. For her, the connection of poetry and film was the predicate of an internationalism she learned by witnessing the impact of nationalism as a serving medic during World War II. She studied in Italy, as Peter mentioned at the beginning, with a group, as we saw in her first film, of international cinephiles shortly after the end of the war, and her Ancona Films production company, Letterhead, proudly boasted Edinburgh, Rome, and New York as its offices. As W.H. Auden, probably her closest British precursor, wrote of the train in Night Mail, Tait's work is always crossing the border, although it did rarely bring her checks or postal orders. By connecting filmmaking to writing and publishing poetry, Tait, in fact, removes it from the commercial industry. Poetry is a signal not for thinking of film as some kind of elite high culture, but in line with the Rose Street poets Scott's revival for a demotic, vernacular, and communitarian art form, whose process includes its sharing, as Tait did in open screenings at Ancona Films in Edinburgh. But poetry is also a signal for a certain kind of self-protection, for Tait's self-abstraction from that clubbable Rose Street atmosphere, which was incredibly male-dominated and in which women's only role was being a muse or arm candy. And it's a removal where she draws a parallel between herself and Emily Dickinson, of whom she wrote, "Emily Dickinson shut herself in a room and wrote about her pain. She wrote, too, about joy." No wonder, when we hear this poem that Edwin Morgan, bemused, called Tait's poetry sometimes prosaic and willful. It is so devastatingly clear in its refusal of any tricks as it reaches for origins and elements. Or, as Tait says of the Edinburgh Film Festival goers and professional critics who were bemused by her films, quote, "It is as if they had difficulty in understanding anything straightforward and clear." While Tait, unlike Dickinson, did work in her community, she also did shut herself in a room, or in the Italian for room, camera. It is in using the camera that Tait appears to open up to writing poetry through the camera that she finds what she wants to write about. In her poem Now, she writes, "Cinematographically, I have registered the opening of Escholzia on an early summer morning. It gave me a sharp awareness of time passing, of exact qualities and values in the light. But I didn't see the movement as movement. I didn't see it with my own direct perception, see the petals moving. Later, on the film, they seem to open swiftly." And Escholzia is the California poppy which you see in color poems. The camera expands and extends Tait's insight, including her insight into the fallibility and limited capacities of human senses. In her poem, The Unbreakable Up, she notes that, quote, "Human beings who form concepts in their minds are somewhere between those extremes of vastness and infinitesimality." It's an extraordinary, modest, apposite, and still startling manifesto for what art practice can do after quantum physics. "Here we are," says Tait, "in the messy middle of things, capable of holding concepts of vastness and infinitesimality in our minds, capable equally of inventing the camera and microscope, and then, if we are looking right, using them to see our own inadequacies, the ways that we are less attuned to the infinitesimal than a California poppy." She does work with the prosaic, Morgan was right. That is, with the everyday, the domestic, the available, because it is willful, because of its insistence on existence. Smallness is a quality we often miss in our capitalist world. It's hard for smallness to go up against the epic, the blockbuster, or the loud hailer. It's often seen as domestic, feminized, depoliticized, and unambitious. Or it's seen as an indulgence. But as Audre Lorde, another great poet of the vernacular, of the unseen and deeply felt, titled one of her best-known essays, "Poetry is not a luxury." Why did Margaret Tait write poetry? Because it is a form of paying attention to the world. Or as Rebecca Solnit writes in Hope in the Dark, "What is the purpose of resisting corporate globalization if not to protect the obscure, the ineffable, the unmarketable, the unmanageable, the local, the poetic, and the eccentric? So they need to be practiced, celebrated, and studied too, right now." Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about something I'm going to call Margaret Tait's ecological eye. And I don't seem to be able to get through a conversation without mentioning my cat. So I'm going to start with with mentioning my cat. So I watch a lot of films at home, and my cat, Julia, is fascinated by Margaret Tait's films. She kind of ignores everything else, but she seems to love them. And I think that the reason for that is that they're just full of animals, people and weather, birds hopping from branch to branch, butterflies airing their wings on dry stone walls, winds racing through long grass, people walking home through slanting snow, the things that cats like to look at out of the window. Tait said, "I'm more interested in filming the landscape, even if it's a minute landscape, than in shooting the scenery." And here she marked out an important distinction. Rather than sort of bonny scenery, Tait's films capture the shifting, darting detail of landscapes, usually Scottish. They capture their unfixable, ever-changing aliveness. And this is something that Becca Volker has picked up on and written about in Sight and Sound recently, the fact that Tait affords equal attention to human subjects and their surroundings, their non-human surroundings. And though Tait moved around a lot, most of her films were made in rural Scotland, many of them in Orkney, where she grew up. The natural world is a major feature in all of them, but I'll put natural in inverted commas because much of what Tait filmed was not natural in the typical sense of that word, as she was well aware. When Tait filmed landscapes, she never attempted to cut humans out of the picture. How could she? She was there with her Bolex. And when Tait filmed townscapes, she sought out the non-human life within them. In Where I Am Is Here, which we've just seen, Tait kind of skips the landmarks and picks out instead the swans on the river, the tree branches, a crocodile of schoolgirls, caged animals in the zoo. And in Landmakar, which we haven't seen, but it's a sort of landscape study of Orkney, Tait focuses on what Ali Smith describes as a dialogue of spirits between a crofter, Mary Graham Sinclair, and the environment in which she lives and works. In this film, we can see the way the crofter shapes the land and the way that the land shapes her. We can even hear the way that it has sculpted her Orcadian accent as she describes the changing seasons and the weather in the voiceover. In Orkney, evidence of ways in which humans have shaped the landscape is completely unavoidable. A combination of climate change and human activity meant that by 3,500 BCE, the archipelago had been totally stripped of trees. The remains of Iron Age settlements and forks poke through the bare ground, and then there's the sheep. There's sheep everywhere, as there are in the rest of the Highlands. The devastating and much mythologised Highland clearances of the 18th century, whereby small farmers or crofters were cleared off the land to make way for sheep, had an enormous impact on the landscapes that Tait filmed. You can't live there without some sort of allusion to the clearances because there's a feeling of them all around you, Tait explained. In The Big Sheep, Tait shows coachloads of tourists streaming into East Sutherland and lorry loads of sheep streaming out. We see an abandoned crofter's cottage that the sheep have made their own home, and a voiceover asks, "Why don't you get the sheep to go and fight for you?" An allusion to the repeated cycles of colonialism and conflict that have swept up Scotland. Though she never makes it explicit, Tait is constantly, often cheekily, drawing connections and equivalencies between animals, humans, landscapes and weather. She's forever closing what Donna Haraway describes as the discredited breach of nature and culture. I think a good example of that we've just seen with the kids sort of behind grates in the park and the caged animals in the zoo. And what's remarkable about Tait's work for me is the way it's so intensely focused on the present moment, the life right in front of her camera, while also conveying a great sense of history and the passing of time. And what strikes me now when I watch Tait's films is that in so carefully trying to capture the present moment, Tait was, perhaps consciously, creating a record of things that have now passed. Not only the people she knew, like her mother, but also the animals they lived with and the environment they shared and the seasons and weather that they relied on. In today's era of accelerating capitalism-fueled climate breakdown, I thought I'd mention that as well, much of which is caused by industrial-scale farming, not only is it important to have a record of how the natural world has changed and is changing, But more than this, it's important to notice how we are not separate, but part of that natural world. And this is what Tait's films quietly and insistently do.
What I wanted to focus on, perhaps in quite a free-form way, is firstly just to think about situating Margaret Tait a little bit in the experimental film world, which, as you already said, so is from marginal to mainstream feature film production, and in a way how extraordinary Margaret Tait was in how she moved and navigated through those different worlds. And of course, deciding to go and study at the Centro Sperimentale was perhaps a very important clue to where she saw herself in terms of what she was looking for, towards a compassionate and observational mode of cinema, but one which was all about the quotidian, to return again to what you were saying, and the non-professional actor, if you like. But I also wondered too if the fact that she didn't also train as a nurse speaks a little bit about the precision of her eye in the way that she frames the if you like, the portraits that she makes, whether it's of children running in the park or whether it's of fellow poets. So I was quite interested in how she navigates those different worlds. One being an observational documentary cinema, and also knowing how important she was to British experimental filmmakers, those associated to the London Filmmakers Co-op later on in the 1970s. And I know that filmmakers, I know of Annabel Nicholson being one, talked about how her films would be showing at the Co-op in London and she would come down and stay over for her films to be shown. But again, what she's doing is very different from those very process-led works that were central to the London Filmmakers cooperative members during the 1970s. You might also say that being an artist and poet in Scotland, we might connect to Norman McLaren and the animation work that he in particular was making. But again, though we see animation coming into her work, and Colour Poems being a good example, but also Ariel, it's not the main focus of her work either. It's also interesting, of course, that the London Filmmakers Co-op started in 1966. She was making these films very much on her own volition through from the 1940s, coming back from the Centro Sperimentale. So you might say she stands as a precedent to the British experimental film scene, which was later to burgeon. And I think for that reason, she was very often seen as a touchstone for them and as a very important figure for them. And you see that looking through many of the programs which for the co-op through the 70s and 80s. Also in early television broadcasts of artist film as well. So, but she's still somehow as a figure apart. She's not part of that canon of Maya Deren and others which emerged through the 1940s and 50s. And you might say there are connections to her work and connections to the diaristic approach of Jonas Mekas, but there's something else again. And this is something that I've always really enjoyed puzzling over. And certainly when I first had an opportunity, thanks to Peter, to write around her work, it was around her use of time. And as a way to try and understand her use of time against other ways in which time has been used in the cinema, and the idea of the cause and effect of methods of time in feature film. And it seemed that her use of time is much more about a metaphorical use of time. And I guess that comes back to her sense of herself as a poet. It feels like time is also quite, I think, prismatic. It's faceted. When we look at these incredibly rich and intense films, we're looking at overlapping times of generational times playing out, particularly, and I loved again to remember her use of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poems, the idea of girl grace, these generations of women, her granddaughter in colour poems there, her grandniece, excuse me, but also the faces of her friends, the faces of Alex Perry, her partner, but this also of a portrait of her mother. So there's a generational time that moves through it. There's also a meteorological time that is also circling there. There's also a sense of a sedimentation, these images of spades going through the earth. You know, it's about time as erosion and decay, at the same time that it's also literalized in some way by her presentation of a kind of metaphysical time, showing us the gravestones in that very first film of hers. So I'm very interested in how all of these forms of time are operating together in a very intense way within these works, which are also, in terms of the timing of their editing, is very, very rhythmic, but very, very close at the same time, excuse me. Space as well. The camera is always often looking down. It's close. It's looking at the textures of the lichen, of decay and time again, and how it's presenting itself in the landscape, but also on the pavement, in the play of water and so on. So I think there's an extraordinary use of space, and these I don't see anywhere else. I mean, she works with an accumulative time in the sense that, as you said, to make the Leaden and the Golden Echo took her over several years, and she would go and she would film with the Bolex, she would go into her studio, she'd watch back. Was it week by week, Peter, that she would go in and watch? And again, place sound against that. So I think the other thing that we haven't perhaps touched on that I just want to raise, which I'm sure many of you felt listening here, was incredibly bold. Her use of sound is. The way that the ambient brushes against the ambient track, brushes against the composers that she's invited to she's commissioned to make soundtracks. And I think, just to finish, a non-synchronous sound, an asynchronous sound perhaps, which again makes me think of herself as a poet, how she thinks very carefully about how you place sound in relation to image, both whether you're doing that within a poem, but within the films as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
No need to clap, please.
Yeah, just keeping an eye on time.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for those contributions. They're really very special. Well, I know some people will probably have come across Margaret Tait's work for the first time. Others have been quite familiar with it or lived with it for quite a while. I did actually just want to ask our three panel, how did they or when did they first come across the work of Margaret Tait? I don't know if you could just briefly say, if you can remember.
Like, you have the most.
Well, I don't know. I mean, for me, Peter's partly responsible, but also for me, it's interesting. It was through another filmmaker. It was through Mary Menkins' work, actually, which I came to first. Who I'm sure many of people know her work, but if you don't, please go and see it. She's another woman who made small films, as Jonas Meekers said. She makes little films, and I was really incensed by this. And then I thought, well, actually, he's right. But as you say, they are enormous. They're small but momentous films. And I felt in a way that that's something that Margaret Tait really shared. So it was Mencken to Tait. But again, I think always looking for, I'm sorry, I'm always counting off in my head when I see a group of filmmakers. Where are the women? How many women are there among these men? And it was fantastic to find here was an extraordinary woman who was making work in quite she wasn't isolated, she was very connected, but she wasn't necessarily getting a lot of support, but she was still tenaciously doing it.
Yeah,
So.
great. Anna, can you remember? Or?
To be honest, it was quite recently.
Yeah.
And I think I just kept hearing about the Margaret Tait Award. And I thought I'd better find out who Margaret Tait was. And and sort of coming to her films quite like relatively fresh. It's kind of struck me like how it kind of takes a while to get into the sort of her rhythm and I think rhythm is really important when you're watching them. And I just kind of realised, because I've watched her films sort of several times just preparing for this event, and when I was watching them again now, I realised how kind of like in sync I've sort of become with them, and how you kind of see and hear different, it's an obvious thing to say, but the more you watch them, the more you get out of them. And there are just things that I'm noticing now that I didn't notice when I first saw them, like her sense of irony, I think, is great, and also her sort of quite, not explicit, but quite a subtle kind of politics that she's always kind of pushing at and edging at. And I think that's particularly obvious in her film, what are they called? Colour Poems. Colour Poems, I think that's quite kind of sharp politically.
Thank you. So?
I wish that I had a sort of parallel history to the one that I did, and that I'd seen Blue Black Permanent on its release in 1992, because I was a baby teenage poet, and I think it would have been incredibly meaningful to see a film by a British woman filmmaker about a genealogy of women poets and artists, but I didn't, because they didn't screen things like Blue Black Permanent at the Edgware ABC, at least in 90. I'm sure it's much more art house now. So I saw the Lux programme from 2006, but I actually saw it in Toronto at the Cinematheque, where it was programmed in the same season as a retrospective of Apichatpong Ethical, whose films I also had never seen before. So discovering these two filmmakers who are incredibly attuned to the living world. His parents were doctors. She had this medical training and practice. Both of them are incredibly interested in vision as a spiritual practice. It was just a kind of magical summer of their works, the way that they see an animate, a sort of animist almost natural world. So they're deeply associated in a very strange way for me. But since being able to work with her chapbooks in the British Library, her work has also taken on another level and layer of experience. Which may, so Sarah Neely's archive work and obviously, Peter, your work with the films, that confluence is really exciting as well, that we're getting the whole of Margaret Tait.
Absolutely.
It's not just a filmmaker.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I'd just like to sort of end, but maybe also setting up the next screening with the Margaret Tait Award winners, and that should be special, and to hear what they have to say. But I was going to say Margaret Tait's films today are just as likely to be found in art galleries as in cinemas. And I was just wondering again if there's just a couple of thoughts you have on what do you think it is about Margaret Tait's work which offers this opportunity for both cinema and the gallery?
I think you could show her work on a wall in the street, in a garden, in a boat shed at Whitstable. I think because she made the work where she was, maybe gallery spaces are a bit more attuned to those, the kind of varieties of filmmaking that Lucy was talking about, that prize, the smallness, the diaristic, the immediate that Anna talked about, and also the environmental consciousness that Anna talked about. But I think it would be great to screen them on the outside of the BFI next to the Thames with the waves, or on the Thames with the waves going through them.
You're hearing it now.
Small project.
You're hearing it from the audience.
Thanks. So,
Well, actually,
Lucy?
I'm going to say, I'm going to maybe flip it back to you, Peter and Sarah, that I think that the advocacy which has been happening around Margaret Tait's work, maybe starting a little bit with those London Filmmakers Co-op screenings, but that you've continued, has meant that the connections you've made, for example, I saw that recently a great show of her work at the Pier Gallery in Stromness in Orkney, but also saw a show at the same time at Stills in Edinburgh. So, but those are down to the connections and the networks which you have been formulating since, I think. just continually placing her work in the forefront, and it being picked up by Sarah and other filmmakers through the Margaret Tait Award as well. So I would say, to kind of continue what you're saying, so I think it could be shown anywhere, but the fact they're shown in this particular context now is through the habilitation work that you have been doing around her work.
Anna, you want?
No? I think that's everything covered. But yeah, just what So mentioned before about, I don't know, she wasn't particularly interested in the sort of commercial cinema, and so it kind of makes sense that her films, I don't know, maybe they would be best suited to be screened outside, or I don't think that they have to be constrained to.
Where would cats be most likely to see them?
Well, that's that important question. Yeah.